This is NPR News, and I'm Chris Farrell. You know, the past year, we lived through a terrible global pandemic that has taken an enormous human toll measured in deaths, illnesses, quality of everyday life. And the pandemic, along with the Texas electricity debacle during a severe cold spell, the spread of wildfires out west, and rising waters in Florida, to name only a few disturbing disasters, has also heightened the need to address global climate change and its impact on societies and economies. The politics of climate change are also shifting with the new Biden administration. The U.S. has rejoined the Paris Accords, an agreement that marked for the first time all countries pledging some kind of action on climate change. This coming Thursday, Earth Day, April 22nd, President Biden will host a leaders summit on climate. President Biden has appointed former U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry as America's climate envoy, and Gina McCarthy, former head of the Environmental Protection Agency, as a domestic climate change czar. The administration's $2 trillion plus infrastructure spending proposal devotes considerable sums toward green research and green investment. So our topic for this hour: when it comes to global climate change, where are we now and where do we need to go? This is the first in a three-part series examining climate change. Now, honored to have three terrific guests. Paul Huttner is Minnesota Public Radio's chief meteorologist and host of the Climate Cast podcast. Paul will have to bow out a few minutes early, so don't think I'm ignoring him toward the end. Welcome, Paul.
Great to see you as always, Chris.
Ann Kelly is an environmental lawyer with 25 years of combined experience in the private and public sectors. She currently leads the Ceres Policy Network and the Business for Innovate Climate Change and Energy Policy. And I'm glad you could join us, Ann.
Thank you so much, Chris. Glad to be with you.
Jamie Alexander is director at Drawdown Labs. Project Drawdown was founded in 2014, and the nonprofit seeks to help the world reach drawdown, the future point in time when levels of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere stop climbing and start steadily to decline. So welcome.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So, Paul, I'll start off with you, and then I'll go to Ann and Jamie with the same question. But Paul, just to start us off, where are we from your perspective when it comes to thinking about global climate change?
Well, the numbers say that we are at an accelerating curve for climate change globally. You know, 2020, the numbers just came in recently. And again, we had the first or second warmest year globally on record in the surface temperature record going back to 1880. And that makes the last 7 years the seven warmest years on record globally. That's never happened before in the surface temperature record going back to 1880. If you are under 44 years old, you've never lived through a cooler than average year globally. 1976 was the last cooler than average year globally compared to the 20th century average. And if you're under 35, you've never even lived through a cooler than average month globally, because February 1985 was the last cooler than average month. I point this out because in a balanced climate system, we should have a relatively even mix of above and below average years according to surface temperature and above and below average months. And yet our climate is so out of balance that we have not seen a below average month since 1985 or a below average year since 1976, Chris.
And you use the term accelerating. So is it like a curve that is going up, a hockey stick faster and faster, or a Nike swoosh? What do you mean when you say accelerating?
It is a very steeply inclined Nike swoosh, I think, Chris. If you look at global CO2, and we can keep records going back at least 800,000 years with ice cores that are very reliable, and as much as 3 million years with other proxy records, the steepness of the curve that we are on for global CO2 being now at 420 parts per million that we passed this year is exponential. I mean, it bounces around in the 250 range for 800,000 years, and then boom, it rockets up to 420 parts per million. So we've actually increased global CO2 by 50% since pre-industrial times. And that is remarkable any way you look at it. And when you change the chemistry of the atmosphere like that, you change the atmosphere's physical response. And that's why we're seeing stronger storms, stronger hurricanes, faster droughts, bigger wildfires. The atmosphere responds to changes in chemistry, and that plays out in our weather and these extreme weather events that we're witnessing.
So, Anne, same question to you from your perspective. Where are we, at this particular moment in history when it comes to global climate change?
Well, thank you, Chris. And I'm so glad you started with Paul, because the most important message is that which we get from our respected climate scientists. And everything we do needs to be science-based. So that's fundamental. And one place we are is we have a federal administration again that accepts and embraces climate science. And I can't tell you how refreshing that is. We are in a positive place when it comes to U.S. climate leadership, which has returned with the Biden-Harris administration. And this week, as you know, President Biden is having a climate leaders summit. And we're going to see some important announcement. In addition to the U.S. joining the Paris Agreement, the U.S. is going to identify its 2030 interim goal this week, and that's a climate target for the U.S. I can talk more about that if you'd like, but it, again, demonstrates a federal commitment to addressing climate change, and it will identify a whole of government approach. So President Biden is looking at all the agencies. He's looking carefully at financial regulation and to make sure we understand climate risk as a systemic financial risk. He's also looking at this from an equity point of view, making certain that environmental justice and disadvantaged communities are equally served and not continually forgotten, as both in the climate change crisis and the environmental crisis more broadly. So I guess we're at an optimistic point. We're at a place where we have a president who has put forward a plan to address climate change, to build up the clean energy sector, to rebuild our infrastructure with more resilience, to electrify transportation. I could go on and on. But as this is Earth Week, I think we are at an optimistic moment that is 100% guided by the climate science.
Jamie, same question to you.
Right. Well, I would definitely, I agree that, I'm really glad that we started with the science, because from an atmospheric perspective, really, really troubling place. Because despite the fact that we kind of paused a lot of our global travel and, air travel and road travel and during the pandemic, our CO2 and methane in the atmosphere continued to rise. So a very troubling place from an atmospheric perspective. But in terms of our societal response, as Anne said, I think this really could be a transformative moment in human history. So we have, as Anne described, the political will. We have tremendous voter support for ambitious climate action. So a recent study from the Yale program on climate change communication said that 70% of voters supported the U.S. rejoining the Paris Agreement. And we have the solutions to do what needs to be done. So at Project Drawdown, we've kind of scoured humanity's wisdom to be able to understand and communicate the practices and technologies that actually address climate change. And we've determined that, yes, we know how to do this. We have the solutions in hand that are being implemented in the world today. So we've got the political will, we've got support of citizens, we have the solutions. And I do think, the last and perhaps the biggest wild card is what business does. And I think business is really coming to the table in a new and significant way. But to me, what businesses do to prove kind of the sincerity of the bold statements that we've been hearing is really important to our chances of limiting warming to where it needs to be.
Okay, so I got lots of follow-up questions. But I want to go back to you, Paul, for a moment. And I was looking at the Bill Gates book, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster, the solutions we have and the breakthroughs we need. And what he's saying there is something that we hear a lot. And I'd like you to unpack, what does this mean? We hear this. He says that if by the year 2050, we don't take out 51 billion tons a year of carbon emissions, we're facing disaster. And you hear variations of that. And it sounds like a big number. 51 billion, that's a big number, right? But what does that actually mean? Can you help us visualize that or grasp the implications of statements like that?
Well, to business, And to us as humans and cities and states, climate change is not an abstraction, right? I mean, we're witnessing a record in the number of billion-dollar weather disasters. Last year, we had 22 events last year. That shatters the record of 16 events from 2011 and 2017. That's the sixth consecutive year we've had 10 or more of these billion-dollar weather and climate disasters. So when we're getting these tremendous superstorms, these supercharged hurricanes that are feeding off of more water vapor in the atmosphere and warmer oceans, and they're going into places like Houston and dumping record rainfalls, and we're seeing these losses in the billions. We're seeing the same thing with wildfires in California. These are producing economic shockwaves to cities, to businesses, and that's translating into their bottom line, Chris. It's not companies are responding to climate change in a very positive way. And they're not doing that just because it's a good PR move. They're doing it because they're seeing these impacts show up in their supply chains and in their bottom lines. I spoke with Jerry Lynch from General Mills, who says, you know, Paul, we can't grow cocoa in areas in West Africa anymore. Where can we grow cocoa as climate begins to shift? He says General Mills is a company that's been around for 150 years. They want to be around for another 150 years. You're seeing the same things, folks I've talked to with Cargill, with Best Buy. So these are companies that already see climate change in their bottom line. And as these impacts begin to grow and accelerate, those shockwaves work their way into company bottom lines. So it's a clear understanding, if you will, from people like Bill Gates, from companies all around America, that, hey, we've got to do something about this because it threatens our sustainability, it threatens our survival, and it threatens our economy. So again, not an abstraction, very real for many of us.
So, Jamie, when I broke into journalism in the early 1980s, the easiest way to get a Wall Street or a financier mad was to talk about ethical investing, responsible investing, socially responsible investing, sustainability. And they would just pour scorn on this idea. Now, it's changed. How much has it changed?
Oh, I think there's been a huge shift, and especially, I think a lot of people thought that again during the pandemic that the trends that we were seeing towards more responsible investing might shift back to sort of a more conservative approach, and instead we saw the opposite. So I think investors are seeing that the impacts of climate change across their portfolios. And people are seeing that they need to be thinking more, kind of more along the lines of multiple stakeholders. So I think we're seeing a big shift here, and I expect that to continue.
And Ann, you mentioned in your opening remarks about a target. And so what are you seeing as a target that the U.S. may pursue?
Well, we would expect there to be a target that would at least include the number 50. And by 50, we mean a 50% reduction in U.S. emissions by 2030. So we know that we have a net zero emissions reduction target for 2050. That's well known, and that's a U.S. target. But the interim goal is so important because we have to have the discipline of taking action now. And the letter that your listeners may have seen last week, and it's being reissued this week, includes over 400 companies calling for just that, asking the Biden administration for the discipline of establishing a 50% reduction by 2030 goal based on modeling that makes it very clear this is doable, this is practical. As Jamie said, we know the solutions, we know how to fix this problem. It's a matter of political will. Investors and companies asking for that target, which will be announced this week. And you mentioned, just want to highlight that two proud Minnesota companies, Target and Best Buy, were part of that letter, along with many others in 50 states, in all sectors, and all sizes of companies have come forward publicly to commit themselves to getting behind that goal. So I think President Biden will feel the chorus of support when they identify the goal. By the way, it's called a nationally determined contribution, which we'll see this week.
So am I being overly optimistic, but has there been a shift from do we need to decarbonize to how do we do it? Jamie? Or Ann? Go ahead, Ann.
I mean, I would certainly say so. And being on Capitol Hill over the last 11 years, there's no question that the conversation turned from whether to how. There's no question about the understanding of this problem being real. There are also bipartisan majorities, as Jamie mentioned, in all states. There are Republicans and Democrats who support the transition to clean energy. They also support the proper transition for fossil fuel workers and coal workers being able to get new jobs in the clean energy economy. Again, this is the Yale Climate Communications website, if your listeners want to look at that. So it's very much about, well, how do we do this? And of course, there's a difference of opinion. There's a difference of opinion about the pace and the scale and the techniques, but that's a robust and constructive discussion.
Jamie, same question to you.
Yeah, I definitely think there's been a shift, and that's not overly optimistic to say at all. I think, as Paul said, people and businesses are feeling the impacts of the climate crisis. Businesses are losing part of their supply chains. They're feeling the pressure from their employees, from their customers and investors. So I think the what to do has been decided. As Ann mentioned, those targets of zero emissions by 2050 and having emissions by 2030 or sooner. Now it's how to do it. And again, we know how. We have the solutions: renewable energy, electric cars, public transit, less food waste, better insulation of our buildings, electric furnaces, protecting and restoring our ecosystems. So we know what to do. So we have the goal, we know how to do it, and we have the solutions. I think what's missing is, or what we need to focus on now is the scaling tactics. So how do we bring these solutions into the world? And that's where policy, investment, the workforce, people actually implementing them, behavior change of companies and individuals, those are sort of, kind of what we're focused on now. How do we scale those solutions in the world?
So just to follow up with you, Jamie, and then I'll go back, same question to you, Ann. So economist Tyler Cowen is at George Mason University, and I think he made an important point, which is that it's not that, Americans want to pollute or they're not environmentally conscious, but they are concerned about cost. And what is this actually going to cost to embrace this less carbonized future? So when we were looking at the politics of global climate change, how does the average consumer cost calculus fit into this?
So our team at Project Drawdown has analyzed this at a global scale, which I think we can then extrapolate to an individual consumer. But on a global scale, if we implement all of the 80 solutions that our team at Project Drawdown has analyzed and determined to be sufficient to the scale of the crisis, it would cost a lot up front, but we would see tremendous savings, something to the tune of 5x return on investment over time. So these are solutions like electric cars, for example, that that cost some upfront, but they actually pay themselves off for electric cars, over the short term. So I think it's, we have to change our mindset a little bit to understand that we may see some costs upfront to make these shifts and, more energy efficient appliances or fixing leaks in our homes or, shifting to electric vehicles. But those, they pay off over the long term financially and in terms of our environment.
And
Chris, can I jump in real
sure,
quickly?
Please. Yeah.
So
please.
Here's an important point, I think, for people to know. We are already paying for climate change right now. Our costs have already increased with climate change. And I'll give you one specific metric on a small scale. In Minnesota, our homeowner insurance rates have more than tripled since 1998. They averaged $368 per year in 1998. Today, that average is $1,348. So you're now paying for this increase in storms already, and you're also doing it through things like infrastructure. When the city of Duluth spends hundreds of millions of dollars to clean up after that flood, that comes out of our tax base. And we're seeing the same thing happen with hurricanes and with extreme storms. So when people think about how much will climate change cost, we're already paying for that. It costs far less to go down the road of these solutions than it does to continue on the path that we're currently on.
And so, yeah, and that's a really important point. But I want to follow up with you, Ann, because I know you're dealing a lot with government officials and talking to them, and there is this tension between the long-term benefits and short-term costs, and you have to sell short-term costs. So, how do you see this unfolding, this conversation, as we get more aggressive?
Yeah, well, we've never been in a better position to make that argument. And Paul's point is well taken. One has to look at the notion of cost in terms of the existing costs of inaction. The costs of inaction have been astounding. We can look at the cost of extreme weather events. We can look at the cost of weather damage, the cost of wildfires. There's any number of parameters we can look at. Climate change right now is costly. It's costing all of us. The other trend that's really important is to look at the ways in which costs have gone down. The cost of renewable energy has plummeted dramatically. Once we scale demand for things like electric vehicles, of course, those costs are going to go down as well. We know this very, very well. Companies figured this out. They did the math. That's why they started buying renewable energy in record amounts over the last 5 years. The numbers are there. So it's really important to destroy this myth that somehow it is costly to pay, more costly to pay for addressing climate change than it is to ignore it. And I suspect Paul has another figure in his, I'm going to ask Paul something, but I think there's another figure here that's pretty important. Because a question I often get from lawmakers, those who don't fully embrace climate action might say, well, no, wait. What about China and India? I suspect that Paul could give us something around an estimate about the per capita emissions for the average American versus the average Chinese person, the average Indian person, the average Nigerian person, the average Japanese person. Guess what? Per capita, the U.S. beats them all. So our responsibility is grave, is serious, is immediate. And if in the very short term, we might pay slightly more, that is something we should seriously consider. The final thing I'll say about costs, though, is we have new data. We have new data that says that it's the wealthy in the U.S., it's those who earn more money that have the larger carbon footprints. So who should really be paying? Enough said. Most of the programs that President Biden has put forward very specifically take account of the impact on low and middle income individuals so that they will not be paying more. In fact, they'll be paying less. Energy efficiency means using less energy, and that means saving money. And 40% of the benefits of President Biden's climate plan, which he's calling it Justice 40% of those benefits are going to go to low income, frontline, disadvantaged communities. So it's a serious question, and it is far too irresponsible to simply say, well, this is going to cost too much. For 50 years, as we've built our environmental law infrastructure, for 50 years, we've been fighting the argument that represents the false choice between economy and environment. That was long ago dismissed, and it's one we have to continue to toss out.
So, Paul, I think the question goes to you.
Well, I'll tell you what, Ann and Jamie both make great points. And here's the thing. I've called climate change solutions our next economic moonshot. With risk and change comes opportunity. And the points of renewable energy are really valid because we've already hit 25% renewable energy in Minnesota. Production in the last couple of years. That happened way faster than people projected it would 10 or 15 years ago. We're seeing wind energy projects booming, wind energy technicians, solar technicians, the fastest growing jobs in the United States. Climate solutions produce jobs, and that produces profits for companies. Mortenson, a big construction firm in Minnesota, $3 billion a year company. Guess how much of their revenue was produced through building renewable energy projects the last few years? $1 billion, a third of their revenue. So we're seeing these companies take advantage of the renewable energy boom. Last year was the busiest year in the Port of Duluth for wind turbine shipments. That created a lot of jobs at the port, at the dock, for truckers who are driving those parts into parts of Minnesota and the upper Midwest, and for the people who assemble those projects. So climate solutions really are a positive thing. And this is a new area of economic growth for us that going forward, I think, is going to be something that really pays off.
And Jamie, are you seeing, renewables, solar, wind? Yeah, we're at an inflection point there because I was recently, of course, everything's over Zoom these days, not in person. But an economist was talking about how stunned they were at the decline in the price of solar relative to what they had been forecasting even just a couple of years ago.
Absolutely, it's been astounding. I think that's partially to do with, as Anne said, companies kind of coming together to aggregating their demand for renewable energy. But just I wanted to come back to a point that Paul just made, was I think is really important, that the more we see this this project of addressing the climate crisis is exactly the same project of upgrading our economy, rebuilding our middle class, addressing racism, improving our cities. These, climate solutions address more than just climate change. We say at Project Drawdown, climate solutions are not just climate solutions. They're things that we all want anyway. And so we can really see this from a multifaceted approach and really look at how are they good for our health? How are they good for our cities? How are they good for equity? And that builds a much broader coalition to support climate solutions scaling in the world.
And so I wanted to ask you, Jamie, when you're working with companies, and again, I was at another presentation, and this is a couple of years ago, and it was a wonderful presentation. This division was doing remarkable work with sustainability, metrics. It was great. I happen to know that another division in their work in Southeast Asia, major pollutant. So there were two divisions, same company. One, what the business told them was, we need to be sustainable to reach our customers. And the other said, we need to operate as cheaply as possible. So how do you, bring these divisions together? Well, the sustainability side over, I guess I should say.
Yeah, that's a really insightful question, and I'd love to hear Anne's thoughts on this as well. But I think that is where we are in corporate sustainability right now. To date, corporate climate leadership has really been primarily focused around emissions reductions targets, and how ambitious should a company be in quote doing less bad or doing less emitting into the atmosphere. And so sustainability teams will make these great and really sincere and ambitious commitments on one side of the company, while the company has products in the world that are that are supporting oil and gas companies and drilling more efficiently, or all kinds of other negative climate impacts they're lobbying for, against climate action. They're silencing their employees who want to help push them faster. There's all kinds of ways that companies influence climate beyond just their emissions. And so I think that's where we are now as a movement, where leaders, true leading companies on climate, are now saying, okay, we need to look at a 360-degree view of our company and all of the ways that we touch climate, and ensure that all of it is aligned and not kind of contradictory.
Anne?
Yeah, you touched on something really important, Chris, and there's no question. I mean, Jamie is right. This is a complex, holistic problem. And what has happened over the last few decades is that companies offshored their manufacturing into places where the environmental standards were not as high, and unfortunately, the labor was very cheap. So again, when you look at the emissions in China, you look at those high emissions, China and the US being the largest emitters. Well, their emissions are high because they're making our products. They're making products that we all buy. So we have to look at that very, very carefully. And I think increasingly, Jamie's right, people are looking at onshoring their manufacturing, restoring American jobs. They're looking at it, really looking at their supply chains to try to build in equity and fairness and to pay a livable wage. It's of the utmost importance and something we have to all take responsibility for. The broader message, I think, and when you're hearing from the White House, though, back to Paul's comment, is yes, the road to economic recovery post-pandemic is through climate action, because we can at the same time create jobs, restore U.S. innovation and competitiveness, and address the climate crisis at once. And those are just the facts.
So let me just take a moment to identify our panelists again. Paul Huttner is Minnesota Public Radio's chief meteorologist. Ann Kelly is head of the Ceres Policy Network and the Business for Innovate Climate Change and Energy Policy. And Jamie Alexander is director at Drawdown Labs. So, Paul, I know you follow, innovation and what's happening with climate change. So are there innovations that you're following that particularly excite you, or you think that we should really be paying close attention to?
Absolutely. And that's one of the really interesting parts of my job, Chris, is that I get to talk to people every week about what's happening with climate solutions, right? I'm a bit of an optimist by nature. I realize
that's
this
a good thing.
Yeah, it's a good thing. It helps me get through the days these days. But I realize that we have a tremendous problem in front of us with climate change, but that the solutions are emerging rapidly and are very exciting. And, folks have mentioned solar power. Solar power is now the cheapest form of electricity in history in many of the projects that are being done. Wind is doing the same. So we've seen that with the electric generation side of things. Transportation, which is now the biggest form of emissions, the biggest slice of the pie, is really sort of the next big opportunity. And of course, we're seeing electric vehicles come forward rapidly. We're also seeing companies developing biofuels, some of those sustainable aviation fuel, and even drop-in biofuels that can replace most, if not all, of gasoline. These are young companies, but they're moving forward very rapidly. So we're seeing a lot of solutions that are coming online that may very well change this curve. And, people talk about wind and solar energy and being able to store that power, right? Battery technology is advancing so rapidly. The costs are falling so quickly. The capability to enhance storage so that we can collect the sun's energy during the day and then transmit that energy at night from battery storage is moving forward rapidly. So, I like to say this, the typewriter was a great idea for about 100 years. It was state of the art until computers came along. The horse and buggy was a great idea until cars came along. And now we're going to be doing energy very differently in 50 years than we were 50 years ago. So I think people have to recognize that this is part of innovation, this is part of change, and it's a real opportunity for us going forward.
Yes, and I remember my first office job. It was very exciting, IBM Selectric, and if you didn't hit the enter button, you could erase a line. We've advanced since then. Jamie, same question to you. I mean, you talk to a lot of companies. I mean, this concept of innovation that is occurring in this field. What are sort of the innovations that you're watching that you feel we should really pay attention to?
Yeah, so I think our analysis really shows that. So we have the technologies and the best practices to address climate change, but technology can help us improve these solutions and scale them faster in the world. And so you see companies working increasingly with climate tech startups that are that come online specifically. Businesses that exist specifically to address, climate change or a specific problem. So you'll see large corporations partnering with small startups to help embed more of that, kind of innovation into their business. And that's something that we've started looking at on my team at Drawdown Labs, sort of like looking at these two different types of companies, like large corporations that have existed for decades or centuries doing things in a certain way, and how quickly can they pivot? How quickly can they sort of like turn the ship around? And then, and then on the other side, these startups that exist really with climate central to their DNA, like they exist in order to address a climate problem, like plant-based meat companies, for example. And so we're sort of working with both of those types of businesses to figure out how we can accelerate work in both of those. Is it kind of the incumbents sort of like racing forward and and steering their ship in a new direction, or is it the small climate startups that are kind of leapfrogging the incumbents? So we're testing both of those theories of change now.
So where do you think you're going to land? What is your data? What are your interviews telling you?
As with most things at Project Drawdown, it's an all of the above approach. We need we need all of the solutions, all of the scaling tactics, all of the kinds of people putting their minds and hearts to this problem.
And Anna wanted to ask you, what have you learned from the politics of the pandemic when it comes to thinking about economic and social change with global climate change? Are there lessons to draw from this pandemic and how it's been dealt with, both positives and negatives? Are there lessons to draw when we're thinking about another global challenge, which is climate change?
Yes, Chris, I think there are some really hard lessons we have to embrace. And of course, fundamentally, first and foremost, it's that the vulnerable among us need to be cared for. And our current system does not create a proper safety net for the most vulnerable, for those who are frontline, disadvantaged, historically disadvantaged companies, including communities of color, many of whom have been on the front lines of the workforce with no choice but to continue to work throughout a raging pandemic. And the tragedy is that as a result, many of them paid in their lives and the lives of their loved ones. When it comes to climate change, those who are least responsible for creating the problem are going to suffer the greatest consequences. And that is true globally and domestically. So it is a profound injustice. And the faith communities have done a really good job of highlighting that this is the core problem is one of climate injustice. So what can we do about that as we look to build climate solutions? Well, again, President Biden is building something called Justice 40. For the first time, he's identified that 40% of all benefits from his climate programs and his investments are going to go to those disadvantaged environmental justice frontline communities, those communities that have suffered the most. One concrete manifestation of that is he's appointed for the first time ever a director of energy justice, Dr. Shalonda Baker, who's in the Department of Energy, who's going to really look at how does our energy policy manifest itself in an unjust way for low-income communities who may pay a much higher percentage in terms of energy bills. What about, and of course, the Environmental Protection Agency, now headed up by Michael Regan from North Carolina, who's able to look at air quality in those vulnerable areas. Well, it turns out we learned through COVID that compromised air quality was going to make one more subject to contracting COVID, and it's going to make it more difficult to recover. We've known about asthma and air quality challenges for years in these communities. So we have to redouble our efforts to make sure that we are keeping equity front and center, and we are distributing the benefits of our new laws and policies in an equitable way. And I think you can count on the Biden administration to do this in a smart way. He's assembled a terrific team from the top down that really, again, puts equity at the center of their efforts.
And Paul, I mean, you've talked to a lot of people, as you mentioned, that's one of the things that you do with your job, and it's been the pandemic year. So how has the pandemic affected or shaped your thinking about persuading, talking to people, addressing climate change?
The first thing that jumped out at me, Chris, as the pandemic unfolded, and of course talking to people on ClimateCast every week, is how many of us really need to go to the office every day? I mean, most of us ended up sort of involuntarily working from home, and the technology is there to do that. I'm fortunate. The weather lab here where I sit is an office in my home, and I am able to work typically here about 4 out of 5 days a week. So I've reduced my transportation carbon footprint, thanks to Minnesota Public Radio, by about 60 to 80%. We're seeing that happen all over. We did temporarily for a year. So I guess the question is, how many people could really work at home 2 or 3 or 4 days a week and still be effective? That could really put a dent in our transportation footprint in the short term going forward. So that's something to think about. And, just the bigger picture of what we've been touching on and talking about with regards to change, right? Change seems scary. It seems big. It seems costly. It's a little frightening at times. But, we didn't leave the Stone Age, right, because we ran out of stones. We left the Stone Age because we invented a better way to do things. And that's going to be the case going forward. And to me, change is exciting and change is an opportunity. So as I talk to people every week on Climate Cast, Chris, I try to keep those themes going and let people know that, hey, it's going to be okay going forward here. And we have some real opportunities ahead of us.
And Jamie, same question to you. I mean, this has been a unbelievable, horrible experience that we've gone through with the pandemic, but there've been all kinds of responses, both politically, by business, by employees. So what do you take away from the pandemic, or have you taken anything away from the pandemic that is going to shape the way you discuss, you promote, you advocate for climate change?
Yeah, well, I really appreciate Anne kind of centering equity in all of this. I think that's exactly right. I guess in addition to that, a second kind of learning I think that we're taking from the pandemic is that businesses really had to practice a skill during the pandemic that I think will be essential to their actual, like, their survival in the age of climate change, and that's the skill of transforming their business models. During the pandemic, entire industries were really decimated, were really hurting. And so many companies had to pivot. They had to shift to different business models if they wanted to survive. So we saw, clothing companies shifting to make masks, or restaurants or breweries shifting to, their business model to make hand sanitizer, auto companies making ventilators. There was this pivot of companies' business models to one that met a societal need and kept their workers employed and kept the doors open. And I think today, many companies, especially in certain sectors, are built on industries and products that are not necessarily compatible with the future that we need to build. And so they're going to need to shift to adapt, to kind of pivot to this new world. And I think a good bet is to pivot to include climate solutions as central to your business model.
And so I want to shift to a question, I was going to say from a listener, but it may be a viewer. And I'm going to direct the question to Paul, because, Paul, you're going to have to leave us in a minute or two. So you get the first question, and then we'll say goodbye. And Lou asks, what can an individual do to make a difference? Who should we lobby? Where should we donate?
Yeah, there's so much that you can do in your own personal life. I mean, small changes can have a huge net effect, cumulative. So all those things that you think about that are common sense. I'm a 100% wind source customer with XL Energy. That's a phone call or a click of a mouse pad to sign up to get 100% of your electric power delivered through either solar or wind. Many companies, energy companies, have that option now around the United States. Obviously, Anne has talked about buying an electric vehicle, that the costs, actually you pay far less for an electric vehicle over the life of the car than you would a gas-powered vehicle these days. So you can always do those things, conserving energy. And of course, we don't advocate here on Climate Cast or in NPR News a particular political candidate, but or idea, but vote. If this is something that's important to you, obviously vote and get active in those areas as well. There's a lot you can do, and when we do it all collectively, when we take small steps, it can have an outsized positive impact, because we need to do better, and there are pathways for us to do that.
Well, Paul, thank you very much, and it's been great to be on you this hour.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Jamie. Thank you, Anne.
See you later. Now, I want to go to a question from Chase, and I think I'm going to direct this one to you, Jamie. Blockchain tech, Bitcoin, NFT, et cetera, now uses as much electricity for computing as all the world's solar power generates. How do we prevent emergent technologies from eating into our climate gains?
I think it's such an important question. I don't know a whole lot about that specific example of Bitcoin, but I think, overall, we are seeing a lot of new companies, new technology companies, whether they're specifically focused on, clean tech or climate tech. And every time I talk to them, I always say, don't make the problem worse in trying to solve it. Like, I think, there's a certain, a lot of climate tech companies exist in order to, and Bitcoin is not an example of a climate tech company, but when I think new technologies come online, it's really important to look at, is this technology replacing an existing technology and doing it better, or doing it more efficiently, or doing it with climate in mind, or is it just adding to our global emissions? And so I think that's a really, really important point, that as we grow, we absolutely need to have climate and our sort of like global carbon budget in mind as we develop these new technologies.
And Anne, I want a question from Peter. And he says, please comment on putting a price on carbon and returning the funds as a dividend to the public. My understanding is that this is the most comprehensive way to address all sources of greenhouse gases from all sectors, not just electricity generation, for example.
Yes, that's absolutely right. And Ceres has for a long time been major supporters of carbon pricing. And just to clarify, just as you've outlined, the idea would be to put a price on carbon, but that the dividends, the proceeds from that price, would then largely be returned to the public. Now, there are several models in Congress, and I think the one you're referencing is one that would have 100% a payback to citizens, which makes perfect sense. And there are hundreds of economists around the world who have stood up for the validity of carbon pricing as a pay for and as a way to, again, reduce carbon emissions. And what we want to do is incent the things we actually want, and we want to put a price on the things that we don't want. This is a very simple economic model that is tried and true. A related model would be to give most of the proceeds back. And again, as I said earlier, making sure that such a price was not punitive on low and middle income individuals, but then also to invest some of that money in sustainable infrastructure, in renewable energy, in the kind of innovation that you referenced before, Chris, that is so vital, things like battery storage and CCUS, things we still need to innovate. So yes, it's a terrific model. I would look for this, both if not in the individual states, such as Minnesota, look for this at the federal level. It might still happen this year, and the federal law is there in place. I just want to make a related comment to highlight something Paul said, which is you in Minnesota should be very proud of Xcel Energy. And I hope you do sign up for the program, the renewable energy program that Paul mentioned. Xcel has committed to reduce its own emissions by 80% by 2030. They've done the math. Xcel has been working on this for a long time. It's really important to support your local power company in its efforts, and I think you should be proud of Xcel.
And Jamie, I want to direct this next question to you. Of course, Anne, please feel free to follow up. But Cynthia, and so Cynthia says, I agree with all these ideas, but all this technology uses precious metals, which must be mined, often in water-sensitive areas, such as our precious boundary waters. How do we factor that into the mix? We cannot pollute our water, or we have a whole different set of problems.
I could not agree more. So we at Project Drawdown, we do account in our modeling. We account for how batteries are mined and places in the salt flats in Bolivia where they're mined. We look at that when we take that into account in our models. So it is, it's still, it's still, electric cars still are, far better for the environment than internal combustion engine cars by that standard. But I think you raise an important point about local issues and local waterways and, our local boreal forests here in the Northland. I think I would like to see companies that are based in a state get more involved in protecting the water, the boundary waters or our forests here. Because I think, companies have been great with, Anne's example of supporting federal policy, and pushing and supporting the federal government and their climate plans. But I also think if they're sincere in their, in their targets, they also need to get involved locally. So seeing, companies based in Minnesota get involved in protecting the boundary waters or the Line 3 pipeline up here in northern Minnesota, I think that's going to be really, really important to engage locally as well.
Anne, any additional comments or thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it's water is of vital importance, and we are well acquainted now with the sort of water climate nexus. And so we absolutely have to be committed to protecting water quality and quantity. It's fair to say we have a water crisis. We don't have a science expert in water on the show today, but let's not kid ourselves. I know it might be hard to think of this in this wonderful state of lakes of Minnesota, and I'm from Michigan, but let's just be honest. Out west, we have a profound water crisis, and we have populations growing in places like Arizona. So we have to take this seriously. Acting locally on water is of the utmost importance. But again, the Biden administration is looking at water very carefully, also looking at water infrastructure. And the comment about precious metals is absolutely true. Again, Jamie indicated earlier, we're looking at this, and hats off to Project Drawdown for looking at this in a 360 way, in a holistic way. So we absolutely have to be careful about the materials that we're using. And water is one of those. Precious metals are one of those. You alluded to something else that's of the utmost importance, which is, well, now wait, some of these technologies are actually eating into our carbon footprint. And I think you might have seen the data from Massachusetts Institute of Technology a couple of weeks ago, which talked about Zoom. We all love Zoom. We've all been surviving on Zoom, but the videos, using the video versus just the audio, is going to use more energy. So that's something that we have to look at carefully as well. We have to be absolutely vigilant and not wrap ourselves around a technology without giving it the proper scrutiny. And that's why we rely on Jamie, because her office does this for all of us. So we need to stay in touch with Project Drawdown as we embrace solutions. The good news is, though, there are some slam dunk solutions that we can all embrace. And I have to throw in a note for a plant-based diet. The data's in for regenerative agriculture, sequestering carbon through soil, which Jamie's office has just done tremendous research on. This is really exciting. You've got General Mills in Minnesota that's got a healthy soils unit. They're really looking carefully at how would you scale regenerative agriculture to incent farmers to sequester carbon in the farmland, in the agricultural process. This is a rich area for exploration. We've got some exciting bills in Congress that have bipartisan support that could make this happen. So I just want to leave your viewers and listeners with, I guess, a sense of hope, because there's all kinds of solutions here that we can pursue, both individually and collectively.
Well, Jamie, we got a question from Marietta, and I think this is a question that you probably get all the time. It's a natural one, but will we have enough electricity?
Wow, that is a great question. I actually haven't gotten that one. I mean, with renewable, yes, of course. I mean, I think that's the beauty of the sun and the wind, that we, that there is an abundance of it. And I think, we're working now with some companies who are really, by their own climate targets, are actually trying to green the grid, green our electrical grid. So a company like Google, for example, they have a really exciting climate commitment where, they're going beyond just looking at how they're reducing their own emissions into how are they greening the electrical grid in every place where they operate 24 hours a day. And so that's not just helping the company, that's actually helping all of society have a cleaner electrical grid. And so I think when those big shifts happen and we're sourcing our electricity from the wind and the sun, yes, there will be enough to go around.
And this question from Brian, I want to address to both of you, because I think this is just important. What opportunities do you see for new college, high school graduates in fields that are addressing climate change? And I'll start with you, Anne.
We could do a whole show on this, Chris. What a wonderful question. I'm so happy to have received it. There are so many opportunities for high school and college graduates to enter this field, like never before, many more than back when Jamie and I graduated. First of all, of course, there's all of the technical fields. So we desperately need people who will be scientists and engineers examining the climate problem and the solutions, looking carefully at innovation in renewable energy, transmission, storage, intermittency of solar and wind, which means that we have to figure out ways to make sure it's consistent and constant. We also need a tremendous number of policy advocates at the state, local, federal, and global level. People who can convince, doing just what Chris's show is doing today, explaining why we need new laws and regulations that will help us get this right. So those are just two areas that I would touch on, but I suspect Jamie has more.
Jamie?
Yeah, I think that's such a great question, and I've been really stunned at just the expansiveness our movement, the climate movement, has taken over the last few years. That there's so much interest in working on this, and I think that is the beauty of climate solutions. That again, we've looked at 80 of them, and they cut across indigenous land management practices and restoring ecosystems in the ocean and in forests and walkable cities and and regenerative agriculture and reduced food waste. They cut across so many different types of skill sets and and interests and passions, where one of the things that excites me most is just there are so many ways to engage in both the solutions out there and, as Anne said, the ways that we scale them through, whether it's through policy or investment. So that's really powerful. And I'd also say, Project Drawdown just launched a video series called Climate Solutions 101 that you can stream for free on our website. And it has a really engaging way of sort of presenting climate solutions and helping, kind of see yourself in it, whether you're, if you're really into hiking and forestry. There are things to do in protecting our forests. If you're a farmer, there are ways to grow food in ways that are good for the soil. There are just so many ways to see yourself in these solutions. So I'd encourage you to check that out for free on our website.
So is there solutions? So Teresa in Minneapolis asks, how do we locate climate-friendly businesses?
Well, I think this, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I would say it can take a little bit of homework. So I've mentioned a few today. I think if you're going to make a purchase, it always makes sense to do a little research quickly. Go to their website, see if they have a sustainability report, ask their proprietor about their own carbon footprint. There's many companies now who are transparent about putting out their own commitment. Ben & Jerry's has done this for years, as has Seventh Generation. Aveda is a wonderful Minnesota company that I haven't referred to yet that has just been has a long time deep sustainability commitment. Most importantly, in terms of the highest levels of emissions, you want to look at your power company. That's why I mentioned Xcel. I don't know where the caller is calling from, but look at the source of power and make sure you're getting as much renewable power as possible. If it's an automobile, which is going to have the biggest impact, again, make sure it has the highest mileage available, or is a hybrid, or is electric. Those are going to be your two largest impacts. In terms of food, you want to go organic when possible. If you want to look at where a company is sourcing its materials and how they're treating the members of their supply chain, be exceptionally careful of any food company if it involves meat of any kind, for the obvious reason. I think you just have to, again, we've all got to be vigilant and do our homework when it comes to whom we are buying from.
So we're almost at the end of the hour. And so a final question for both of you. And I'll start with you, Anne, and then go to Jamie. So we've learned a lot during this hour. We've talked a lot with this hour now as we talk to our family members, we talk to our community, colleagues. A takeaway, a thought that you want people to take away from this hour, that you think this is the thing I want you to sit down at the table and have a conversation with because of the discussion that we had today. Anne?
I think the word that leaps to mind for me is optimism. That you can sit down with your family members and say, we have all the tools we need to address this global crisis. And we can do that starting today. And to really empower your family members to take action on many of the actions that we discussed today. But I'd want to leave people with a can-do, optimistic feeling. And I feel that especially since the election. And I'm, of course, also very proud of your Minnesota senators, by the way, Senator Smith and Senator Klobuchar. There's great things that can be done on an individual level, on a scientific level, on a political level, in terms of one's career. So I would say optimistically, let's roll up our sleeves and get started.
And Jamie?
Yes, I agree with you, Anne. And I think we need so many things right now. There's so much work to be done. And this is quite literally the work of our lifetimes. We need all of it. And so this is a project that every human being could spend, all of their energy on, and it would be so worthy of it. So there's so much to do and so many ways to contribute. And so seeing more and more people find their part in it, not necessarily in like going out and finding a job at a climate nonprofit or a sustainability role in a company, but finding climate in your current, where you stand today, in your current role, in your current, whatever makes you excited, whatever your passions are, finding a climate angle to that is really powerful. Then you get to bring your full self to the work and contribute from where you are, because we really need it all. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. This has been really enjoyable. Learned a lot this hour, so thank you.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Chris.
My guests have been Paul Huttner, Minnesota Public Radio's chief meteorologist, Ann Kelly, head of the Series Policy Network and the Business for Innovate Climate Change and Energy Policy, and Jamie Alexander, director at Drawdown Labs. You're listening to the first in a three-part series on global climate change. Today, we looked into where we are now and where do we need to go. On May 18th, the conversation will focus on how do we adapt the economics of going green. And on June 15th, we'll look at how can we invest with a sustainability mindset. Environmental, social, and governance, better known as ESG, can help investors build an ethical investment strategy that delivers solid returns. This program has been produced by Kelly Gordon. Thanks a lot.